In February 1919, a fire consumed the Boone County Courthouse in central Missouri. Among the salvaged fragments, investigators found Sheriff Cartwright's private ledger. The entries revealed names, dates, and dollar amounts spanning 30 years. One notation stood out. Grace Talbot, age 17, listed alongside livestock and property transfers. Before we dive into the story, quick question. What's the creepiest case you've ever heard? Experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The ledger had been kept separate from official county records, hidden in Cartwright's desk drawer for reasons that became clear upon examination. Each page documented transactions that never appeared in public files, arranged chronologically and marked with careful precision. Land transfers, livestock sales, crop yields from various farms throughout the county. Standard agricultural bookkeeping for rural Missouri in the early 20th century. But buried within these ordinary entries, certain notations stood apart. They appeared sporadically, always in the same careful handwriting, always following the same format. A name, an age, a location, and a sum of money. Sometimes the entries included additional details, duration, specific arrangements, names of other parties involved. The pattern repeated across years, across decades, telling a story that existed in the gaps between official history. Grace Talbot, age 17, appeared in an entry dated November 1918. The notation placed her alongside livestock transfers and property exchanges from the Talbot family holdings in the hills north of Columbia. No explanation accompanied her name, no indication of what the transaction represented or why a young woman's details appeared in a document tracking agricultural commerce. Sheriff Cartwright had died in the courthouse fire, taking his knowledge of these entries with him. But the ledger itself survived, passed to his successor, along with boxes of other salvaged documents. For months, it sat unexamined, just another artifact from a destroyed archive. Only when a routine investigation into property disputes required consultation of old land records did anyone notice the peculiar pattern hidden within the pages. The new sheriff, a man named Douglas Finch, who'd transferred from Kansas City, recognized immediately that these entries represented something beyond standard bookkeeping. He'd seen similar documentation before, in cases involving exploitation and trafficking in urban settings. But this ledger suggested something different, something that had operated for 3 decades in plain sight, protected by isolation and the kind of silence that rural communities maintained when outsiders asked questions. Finch began cross-referencing the names against county birth records, marriage certificates, tax documents. Most of the individuals listed in the suspicious entries came from a handful of families living in the remote hollows northeast of Columbia, areas where roads barely existed and government authority rarely penetrated. The Talbot name appeared most frequently, connected to transactions spanning back to 1890. What Finch discovered in those initial weeks of investigation suggested that something terrible had been operating in Boone County for longer than anyone had imagined, a system that treated human beings as commodities and kept its operations hidden behind the walls of family loyalty and geographic isolation. Grace Talbot was born in 1901 in a hollow that had no official name on any map. The land belonged to her grandfather, Vernon Talbot, though ownership meant something different there than it did in the towns and cities beyond the ridgeline. Vernon controlled everything within those valley walls. Who married whom, who worked which fields, who spoke and who stayed silent. The compound itself sprawled across 200 acres of timber and bottomland, connected by footpaths that only family members knew. Cabins clustered near the creek, built from logs cut on the property and arranged in a pattern that spoke to hierarchy rather than convenience. Vernon's house sat highest on the slope, looking down on the others like a watchtower. His sons and their families occupied the next tier. Then came the unmarried adults, and finally the children's quarters where Grace spent her early years. Visitors never came to the hollow. The Talbots traded in Columbia occasionally, selling timber and furs, buying supplies that couldn't be produced on the land. But these trips happened infrequently and always under Vernon's supervision. He maintained relationships with certain merchants and officials, relationships built on mutual benefit and careful silence about what happened in the hills. Grace learned early that women in the family existed to serve specific purposes. They worked the gardens, preserved food, made clothing, and produced children. But more than that, they represented assets that Vernon managed with the same attention he gave to livestock breeding. He studied bloodlines, tracked which girls inherited which traits, noted their appearances and temperaments in a leather journal he kept locked in his desk. By the time Grace turned 10, she understood that her cousin Sarah's disappearance the previous winter hadn't been a marriage to a farmer in the next county, despite what the adults claimed. Sarah had been 17, pretty, and useful. Vernon had called it a placement, a temporary arrangement that would benefit the family. Sarah returned 8 months later, thinner and quieter, her eyes holding something that Grace couldn't name, but recognized as damage. Other cousins followed the same pattern. They'd be told they were going to work for a wealthy family, or help an elderly widower manage his household, or serve as a companion to a sick woman who needed care. The arrangements always came with money that went directly to Vernon, never to the girls themselves. Some placements lasted months, others only weeks. The girls never spoke about where they'd been or what they'd done, and asking questions earned swift punishment. Vernon justified everything through scripture and tradition. He preached on Sundays in the clearing behind his house, telling the family that their way of life preserved old values that the outside world had abandoned. Women were meant to obey, children to serve, and the family to protect itself against government interference and modern corruption. Anyone who questioned these teachings found themselves isolated, denied food, or beaten in front of the others as a lesson. Grace's mother had been one of Vernon's daughters, married off to his nephew to keep bloodlines concentrated and loyalty absolute. She'd borne 6 children, 3 of whom survived past infancy. Grace was the eldest, which meant she'd been watching, learning, and understanding longer than her younger brothers. She knew what awaited her, knew that Vernon had already started evaluating her the way he evaluated horses before selling them. The Hollow operated as its own nation, governed by Vernon's absolute authority and protected by geography that made intervention nearly impossible. Grace turned 14 in the spring of 1915, and that's when Vernon called her to his house for the first time alone. She climbed the path to his cabin with her stomach knotted, knowing that this conversation would change everything. Inside, he sat at his desk with the leather journal open, studying pages filled with his careful handwriting. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The family had arrangements with certain men in the surrounding counties, he explained. Respectable men who needed help with their households, who valued discretion and paid well for reliable service. These arrangements benefited everyone. The men received assistance they couldn't find elsewhere. The family received income and protection, and the girls learned skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Grace listened as Vernon described the system he'd built over decades. Each placement was carefully negotiated, with terms that specified duration, compensation, and expectations. The men were vetted, their reputations confirmed, their ability to pay verified. Everything was documented in his ledger, everything tracked with the precision of a businessman managing valuable inventory. What he didn't say, but what Grace already understood, was that these arrangements had nothing to do with housework or legitimate employment. The girls who returned from placements carried a particular kind of damage, a hollowness that came from being used in ways that destroyed something fundamental. Vernon's careful language about domestic service and respectable households masked a business built on exploitation. The system worked because everyone involved had reasons to maintain silence. The men who paid for these arrangements were often prominent in their communities: merchants, farmers with substantial acreage, occasionally even local officials. They couldn't risk exposure of what they'd participated in. Vernon held leverage over them through the simple fact of their involvement, which gave him protection and influence that extended far beyond the hollow. For the families providing the girls, poverty and isolation made resistance nearly impossible. Vernon's network included several other clans scattered through the central Missouri hills, all operating similar systems and all protecting each other through mutual silence. A family that refused to participate found itself cut off from trade, from marriage prospects, from the web of connections that made survival possible in those remote areas. Grace learned that the ledger contained entries going back to 1890, when Vernon had first established the system. Dozens of names, dozens of placements, a carefully maintained record of transactions that treated young women as commodities. Some girls had been placed multiple times, sent to different men as needed. Others had disappeared entirely after certain arrangements, their fates unrecorded and unquestioned. Vernon showed Grace a page with her cousin Sarah's entries. 3 different placements over 2 years, each lasting several months, each generating substantial income for the family. Sarah had just been placed again, this time with a widower near Jefferson City, who'd specifically requested someone young and compliant. The notation included details about payment terms and expected duration. This was Grace's future, laid out in Vernon's meticulous handwriting. She would be placed soon, he told her. Several men had already inquired, and he was evaluating which arrangement would prove most advantageous. She should prepare herself mentally and understand that resistance would be pointless. The family's survival depended on these arrangements, and individual preferences meant nothing against collective necessity. Grace walked back down the path to her cabin, understanding that she'd just been given her sentence, and that escape from Vernon's system seemed as impossible as escaping the hollow itself. 3 years passed before Vernon selected Grace's placement. She spent that time watching other girls leave and return, each one carrying the same defeated silence. Then, in April 1918, Vernon told her she'd be going to August Dietrich, a German immigrant farmer whose wife had died the previous winter. Dietrich lived 30 miles west, far enough that Grace couldn't walk home even if she tried. Vernon and 2 of his sons drove her there in a wagon, the journey taking most of a day over rough country roads. They didn't speak to her during the trip, and she knew better than to ask questions. The Dietrich farm was larger than she'd expected, with good bottomland and a substantial house that spoke to years of successful harvests. August met them at the door, a man in his 50s with calloused hands and eyes that wouldn't meet hers directly. Vernon and August spoke in low voices on the porch, while Grace waited with her small bundle of belongings. Money changed hands. Vernon counted it carefully before shaking August's hand and leaving without saying goodbye to Grace. She watched the wagon disappear down the road, taking with it any illusion that this was anything other than a sale. August showed her to a small room off the kitchen, explaining in accented English that she'd be responsible for cooking, cleaning, and managing the household. His late wife had handled everything, and the farm had fallen into disorder since her death. Grace nodded, understanding that whatever he said about housework, the real expectations would reveal themselves soon enough. The first week passed in a haze of labor. August's definition of household management included work that would have required 3 women to complete properly. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent days washing clothes by hand, scrubbing floors, tending the vegetable garden, preparing meals, and managing tasks that left her exhausted by nightfall. But the housework was only part of what August had paid for. On the 8th night, he came to her room and made clear what Vernon's arrangement actually entailed. Grace had known this was coming, had prepared herself as much as anyone could prepare for such things, but knowledge didn't make it easier to endure. The months that followed established a routine of labor and violation. August treated her with neither cruelty nor kindness, simply as property he'd temporarily acquired. He fed her adequately, didn't beat her, and expected her to fulfill the terms that Vernon had negotiated. In his mind, everything was legitimate business. Grace discovered she was pregnant in September. August showed no particular reaction to this news, treating it as an expected outcome rather than a complication. He continued using her throughout the pregnancy, indifferent to her discomfort or the risks involved. When her time came in February 1919, August brought a midwife from town who asked no questions and accepted payment for silence. The birth was difficult, lasting through a long winter night. Grace held her daughter for perhaps an hour before Vernon arrived to collect the infant. He'd arranged a placement for the child with his daughter Esther, who'd been unable to conceive. The baby would be raised as Esther's own, and Grace would never speak of the birth or claim any connection to the child. Vernon made this clear before he left, with the infant wrapped in blankets. August drove Grace back to the Hollow 2 days later, already paid in full for the 6-month arrangement. Vernon counted her as inventory returned, ready for the next placement whenever demand required. The Talbot operation wasn't unique. Sheriff Finch's investigation in 1920 revealed at least 4 other families running identical systems throughout central Missouri. The Hackett clan in Callaway County, the Lydells near the Osage River, the Crenshaw family in the hills above Herman, all maintaining the same careful silence about their arrangements. These families had operated for decades through a combination of geographic isolation and strategic relationships with local power structures. County officials who asked uncomfortable questions found themselves facing mysterious difficulties. Tax assessments became unfavorable, legal disputes went against them, business relationships soured without explanation. The message was clear. Certain questions shouldn't be asked. In 1916, a deputy named William Trowbridge attempted to investigate rumors about the Crenshaw family after a girl from their compound appeared in Herman with visible injuries. Trowbridge was young, new to the region, and didn't understand the unwritten rules that governed these remote communities. He began interviewing people, asking about family structures and unexplained absences. Trowbridge disappeared in November 1916. His horse returned without him, and searches found no trace of his body. The official conclusion was that he'd fallen from his mount and drowned in the Gasconade River. though no evidence supported this theory. His personal investigation notes vanished from the sheriff's office, and the case was quietly closed. The network protected itself through mutual interest. Men who'd paid for arrangements had every reason to ensure the system continued operating without scrutiny. Family patriarchs like Vernon maintained detailed records on everyone involved, creating a web of compromised individuals who couldn't expose the network without implicating themselves. Local merchants benefited from the family's business and asked no questions about where money came from. Some doctors and midwives had delivered babies from these arrangements, accepting payment for silence. Even certain clergymen had blessed marriages between girls from the network and men who'd first encountered them through placements, legitimizing relationships that had begun as transactions. The system also exploited legal limitations of the era. Law enforcement in rural Missouri was sparse, with sheriffs covering vast territories and lacking resources for complex investigations. Family matters were considered private, and authorities were reluctant to intervene in what could be presented as domestic arrangements. Women had limited legal standing, and young women from isolated families had even less. Cultural attitudes reinforced the network's stability. The early 20th century still operated on assumptions about paternal authority and family autonomy that made questioning these arrangements socially difficult. Communities valued privacy and self-sufficiency, viewing government intervention as unwelcome intrusion even when abuse was obvious. Vernon's ledger later revealed payments to specific officials, though whether these constituted bribes or legitimate fees for services remained ambiguous. A justice of the peace in Cooper County had received regular sums for performing marriages that connected network families. A county clerk had been paid for expediting certain document filings while delaying others. These transactions created financial ties that further protected the system. The network also maintained its own internal enforcement. Families who considered breaking silence were reminded of what happened to those who betrayed the collective. Girls who tried to escape found themselves hunted by relatives who dragged them back to face punishment that served as warning to others. The system sustained itself through fear, complicity, and the calculated exploitation of every weakness in rural law enforcement and social structures. By the time Grace returned from August Dietrich's farm, she understood that escape wasn't just a matter of running away. It required dismantling an entire network built on decades of calculated silence. Vernon gave Grace 6 months at the Hollow before arranging her second placement. In January 1920, she found herself being delivered to Harold Kemp's residence in Jefferson City, a substantial brick house on a tree-lined street that seemed impossibly distant from everything she'd known. Kemp was a businessman in his early 40s, a widower who'd made his fortune in lumber contracts with the state government. Vernon had negotiated premium terms for this arrangement, double what August Dietrich had paid, reflecting both Kemp's wealth and Grace's proven fertility. The transaction was conducted in Kemp's study, while Grace waited in the foyer, staring at wallpaper that probably cost more than everything her family owned. But Harold Kemp was not August Dietrich. He had 2 daughters, aged 12 and 14, who lived with him and attended the local school. They stared at Grace with curiosity when she arrived, asking their father who she was and why she'd be staying with them. Kemp introduced her as a housekeeper, but the discomfort in his voice suggested he understood exactly what he'd actually purchased. The first week passed strangely. Kemp seemed uncertain how to proceed with the arrangement he'd paid for. He treated Grace with awkward formality, showing her the household routines and explaining what his daughters needed. His late wife had died 2 years earlier, and the house still carried traces of her presence in ways that made the situation feel even more wrong. Grace performed her duties efficiently, caring for the girls and managing the household. She'd learned from her time with August that compliance made things easier, and she had no reason to believe this placement would be any different once Kemp overcame his apparent hesitation. But on the 10th night, when Kemp finally came to her room, something unexpected happened. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then apologized and left. Grace lay awake afterward, confused and afraid that his change of mind would somehow make things worse. The next morning, Kemp asked to speak with her privately. He said that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he hadn't fully understood what he was participating in when Vernon had approached him. His daughters were not much younger than Grace, and the arrangement felt like a betrayal of everything he wanted them to grow up believing about the world. Grace said nothing at first, trained by years in the Hollow to trust no one, especially men who claimed good intentions. But Kemp continued, explaining that he had a friend who'd prosecuted trafficking cases in St. Louis, someone who might be able to help if Grace was willing to testify about what the Talbot family had done. The word trafficking meant nothing to Grace. She'd never heard the term applied to what Vernon did, had never imagined that the arrangements might be illegal rather than simply terrible. Kemp explained carefully, describing laws that prohibited what he called white slavery, explaining that what Vernon operated was a criminal enterprise that could be prosecuted if evidence could be gathered. Grace felt something shift inside her, a possibility she'd never allowed herself to consider. She began talking, telling Kemp everything about the Hollow, about Vernon's system, about the other families involved. Kemp took notes, his expression growing darker as she spoke. Within days, he'd contacted his attorney friend and set in motion events that would either free Grace or get them both killed. Vernon's network had operated for 30 years without serious challenge, and they wouldn't surrender their business without a fight. Harold Kemp understood that Grace couldn't stay in Jefferson City once Vernon realized something had gone wrong. The network had eyes throughout central Missouri, and a girl who vanished from a legitimate placement would trigger immediate searches. Kemp needed to move her somewhere beyond Vernon's reach, while his attorney friend built a case strong enough to challenge the entire system. In early March 1920, Kemp arranged Grace's disappearance. He told his household staff that she'd received word of a family emergency and departed suddenly. To Vernon, he sent a telegram claiming Grace had stolen money and fled, expressing his anger at being deceived about her character. The lie bought time, making Vernon believe Grace had simply run rather than revealing the truth to outsiders. Kemp personally drove Grace to Kansas City, a journey of several hours that took them far beyond the territory Vernon's family controlled. He'd arranged lodging at a boarding house operated by a widow named Margaret Hoffman, a woman he'd known through business connections and trusted to keep secrets. Grace was registered under the name Mary Sullivan, a fiction that would protect her while attorneys worked. The boarding house sat in a working-class neighborhood where newcomers attracted little attention. Grace shared a room with 2 factory workers who asked no questions about her background. Margaret provided meals and safety in exchange for help with housework, an arrangement that gave Grace legitimate occupation while she waited. But hiding meant living with constant fear. Every knock on the door might be Vernon's sons coming to drag her back. Every stranger on the street could be someone from the network who'd recognize her despite the distance. Grace rarely left the boarding house, spending her days helping Margaret and her nights lying awake, listening for sounds that might signal discovery. Meanwhile, Kemp's attorney friend, a man named Robert Chen, who'd successfully prosecuted several trafficking cases in St. Louis, began the dangerous work of building a legal case. He interviewed Grace extensively, documenting everything she remembered about Vernon's operation. The challenge was enormous. Grace's testimony alone wouldn't be enough to bring down a network that had operated for 3 decades. Chen needed Vernon's ledger, the physical evidence that documented the entire system. Kemp had copied what he could during Grace's stay, but those notes were second-hand and might not hold up in court. They needed the original, which meant somehow obtaining it from Vernon's locked desk in a compound surrounded by family members who'd kill to protect their secrets. In April, Vernon's sons appeared in Jefferson City asking questions about Grace. They visited businesses, spoke with Kemp's neighbors, and made clear through thinly veiled threats that they wanted information about where she'd gone. Kemp maintained his story about being a victim of theft, playing the role of an angry customer demanding Vernon control his family members better. The visit terrified Grace when Kemp reported it during one of his careful trips to Kansas City. Vernon's reach extended farther than she'd hoped, and his determination to find her suggested he understood that her disappearance represented a threat to his entire operation. A girl who simply ran away was one thing. A girl who might be talking to authorities was something else entirely. Chen warned that they were running out of time. Either they moved forward with prosecution soon, accepting the limitations of their evidence, or Vernon would eventually find Grace and silence her permanently. The decision fell to Grace herself. Risk everything on an imperfect case, or spend the rest of her life hiding from the family that considered her property. Robert Chen made a decision that changed everything. He contacted federal investigators in St. Louis, framing the Talbot network as an interstate trafficking operation. If Grace had been transported across county lines for immoral purposes, and if the network had operated in multiple counties, federal jurisdiction applied. That meant resources and authority that local Missouri officials couldn't provide. 2 federal agents arrived in Kansas City in late May 1920. They interviewed Grace over 3 days, taking detailed statements about every placement, every transaction she'd witnessed, every name she could remember. The questioning was exhausting and humiliating, forcing her to describe experiences she'd tried to bury. But the agents treated her testimony seriously, recognizing patterns they'd seen in urban trafficking cases. What made Grace's account particularly valuable was her knowledge of Vernon's documentation system. She described the leather ledger in detail, explained how Vernon recorded every transaction, and identified other families involved in the network. This information gave investigators specific targets and evidence to pursue. The agents began quiet interviews with other women who'd escaped or been released from similar arrangements. Some refused to speak, too afraid of retaliation or too damaged to relive their experiences. But others came forward, each testimony adding another piece to the pattern Chen was building. A woman named Elizabeth Hackett, who'd been part of the Callaway County network, provided details that corroborated Grace's account. She'd been placed with 5 different men over 4 years before being married off to a farmer who'd wanted permanent acquisition rather than temporary rental. Her husband had died in 1918, finally freeing her to speak without fear of his retaliation. Another woman, Martha Lydell, described being sold at age 15 to a merchant in Boonville. She'd borne 3 children during that placement, all taken by her family immediately after birth. Martha had eventually been returned to the Lydell compound when the merchant tired of her, where she was married to her cousin and forbidden from ever mentioning what had happened. By July, investigators had documented 34 women who'd been exploited through the network. The actual number was certainly higher, but many victims had died, disappeared, or refused to come forward. Even these 34 cases represented decades of systematic abuse that had operated with complete impunity. The federal agents decided to move against Vernon directly. On August 12, 1920, they arrived at the Hollow with local sheriff deputies and warrants for Vernon's arrest. The family initially tried to refuse them entry, but the presence of federal authority and armed deputies made resistance impossible. Vernon was taken into custody along with 3 of his sons, who'd actively participated in arranging placements. Investigators seized Vernon's ledger from his desk, along with boxes of correspondence and financial records that documented the entire operation. The evidence was even more comprehensive than Grace had described, containing details about transactions going back 30 years. Other families in the network learned quickly about Vernon's arrest. Some attempted to destroy their own records. Others fled to relatives in different states. The Crenshaw family burned their compound entirely, eliminating evidence, but also drawing attention that led to their eventual prosecution. Grace remained in Kansas City throughout the raids, protected by federal agents who understood that Vernon's family would target her if given the opportunity. She'd set everything in motion by trusting Harold Kemp, and now the entire network faced exposure. Whether the legal system would actually deliver justice remained uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Grace allowed herself to hope. The trial began in October 1920 in the federal courthouse in Columbia, drawing newspaper attention from across Missouri. Reporters filled the gallery, though editors carefully managed their coverage to avoid explicit details about the nature of the crimes. Headlines spoke of white slavery rings and rural trafficking networks, using language that acknowledged horror while protecting readers from its full scope. Vernon Talbot sat at the defense table flanked by his sons, all 3 maintaining expressions of righteous indignation. Their attorney, a Columbia lawyer named Thomas Burdett, built a defense around family autonomy and consensual arrangements. These were domestic employment agreements, he argued, legitimate placements of family members in respectable households. Any suggestion of coercion or exploitation was fabrication from troubled girls seeking attention. The prosecution opened with Vernon's ledger, entering it as evidence, and methodically walking the jury through years of documented transactions. Each entry showed a pattern: young women's names, ages, duration of placement, and payment amounts. The ledger contradicted any claim of legitimate employment. No housekeeper was rented by the month, with detailed payment schedules that resembled livestock sales. Robert Chen called Grace as his first witness. She took the stand wearing a simple dress provided by Margaret Hoffman, her hands shaking as she swore the oath. Chen guided her through her testimony carefully, establishing her background in the Hollow, describing the system Vernon had explained to her at 14, and detailing her placements with August Dietrich and Harold Kemp. Burdett's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested Grace had been a willing participant who now fabricated abuse claims out of spite. He questioned why she'd never attempted escape during her first placement, implying that contentment rather than coercion explained her compliance. Grace answered quietly, explaining that escape had been impossible when she had nowhere to go and no understanding that what Vernon did was illegal. The prosecution called other victims over the following days. Elizabeth Hackett described her 4 years in the Callaway County network. Martha Lydell testified about losing 3 children to forced adoption. Each woman's testimony built on the others, creating a portrait of systematic exploitation that no defense argument could fully dismiss. Harold Kemp testified about his arrangement with Vernon, admitting his own guilt while explaining how the system functioned from a buyer's perspective. His testimony was devastating because it came from someone with no reason to lie, a respectable businessman confessing his participation in crimes that destroyed young women's lives. August Dietrich was compelled to testify under subpoena. He maintained that he'd believed the arrangement was legitimate, that Vernon had presented Grace as a willing worker seeking employment. But under Chen's questioning, Dietrich admitted he'd never asked Grace directly if she wanted to be there, never inquired about her ability to leave, never questioned why a 17-year-old girl would be available for a 6-month placement far from her family. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Burdett called character witnesses who described Vernon as a pillar of his community, a religious man who'd raised his family according to traditional values. But these testimonials collapsed against the weight of Vernon's own ledger and the testimony of women he'd exploited. The jury deliberated 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Vernon was convicted of conspiracy, procuring for immoral purposes, and multiple counts related to interstate trafficking. 2 of his sons received similar convictions. Sentencing came swiftly. Vernon received 20 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. Grace watched the verdicts from the gallery, surrounded by federal agents who'd protected her throughout the trial. Justice had arrived, imperfect and incomplete, but real nonetheless. Vernon Talbot died in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1923, 3 years into his sentence. Prison records listed heart failure as the cause, though some believed he'd simply given up once his empire collapsed. His sons served their full terms, released in the early 1930s, to a world that had forgotten their crimes and families, that wanted nothing to do with them. The network Vernon built didn't survive his conviction. Federal prosecutions dismantled the other families involved, with the Hacketts, Liddells, and Crenshaws all facing charges that sent patriarchs to prison and scattered their clans. The compound in the Hollow was abandoned within months of the trial, the cabins left to rot as family members dispersed to avoid the shame of association. Grace never returned to Missouri. With help from Robert Chen and Margaret Hoffman, she traveled to California in early 1921, carrying letters of introduction to families who might employ her legitimately. She found work with a family in San Diego, a position that offered dignity rather than exploitation. In 1924, she met a carpenter named James Whitlock, who knew nothing of her past. They married that summer, and Grace became someone entirely new, building a life defined by choices rather than transactions. She bore 3 children who grew up believing their mother had come from a small Missouri town, nothing more. The truth about the Hollow remained locked away, shared with no one except James, who loved her enough to never ask for details she couldn't bear to provide. Grace lived quietly for decades, raising her children and working alongside James in the carpentry business they built together. She never spoke publicly about what had happened until 1959, when a researcher studying rural crime in early 20th century Missouri tracked her down through court records. The interview was brief and carefully controlled. Grace, then 58 years old, spoke about the system Vernon had operated, but avoided personal specifics that might re-traumatize her or compromise the privacy she'd built. She wanted the story documented, she explained, because silence had protected men like Vernon for too long. Future generations needed to understand how exploitation thrived in isolated communities where women had no legal protection and family authority operated without oversight. The researcher's work remained obscure, published in an academic journal that few people read. Grace's story stayed buried in archives until the 1990s, when historians examining rural Missouri discovered the trial transcripts and began piecing together the full scope of what had happened in those remote hollows. By then, Grace had been dead for 15 years, having lived to 73 before passing peacefully in her sleep. Her children learned the truth about their mother's early life only after her death, when the historians contacted them seeking permission to include her story in their research. They granted it, understanding that their mother's courage deserved recognition, even if she'd never sought it herself. The hollow where Grace was born is gone now, reclaimed by forest, with barely a trace of the cabins that once stood there. But the records remain, preserved in federal archives and county historical societies, documenting a system that exploited dozens of women across 3 decades before one 19-year-old girl found the courage to speak and the luck to be heard. Grace's story reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by silence and normalized through tradition, and that sometimes one voice is enough to bring it down. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the systems that still exploit the vulnerable today, click that like button and subscribe to the channel. We uncover the buried truths that demand to be remembered. Share this story, because Grace's courage deserves to be known, and because the best way to prevent history from repeating is to refuse to forget it ever happened.